Well, I am thrilled. Many thanks to the Mind Institute for inviting me to speak today and to share my research with you and about the transition to adulthood for autistic people and I really appreciate the name of this conference, We Belong. It really speaks to me as the daughter of a person with a disability, personally, and also as a mother of disabled daughters. And I really also, it speaks to me as a researcher, as this has been one of my passions, is to really understand, how to create inclusion, how to change society, how to make outcomes, better. And so I am, as Avin said, the faculty lead of the Social Dynamics of Intervention Lab, which is at the A.J. Drexel Autism Institute. At the lab, we are conducting research about social connectivity. We have many partnerships with community members, and we work closely with them to create a just and inclusive society for all people and communities. We use several different methods in the lab, and primarily we use social network methods. So you're going to see me present to you some funny maps with circles and lines, and that's how we measure connections. So I'm going to be sharing some of that research with you today. But we also use qualitative methods to really learn from people's lived experience, what these networks and connections mean to them and how they make a difference. I want to just take a minute to thank my funders and my many colleagues who are on these grants with me, and also the community members who partner with me on several of these grants to produce some of the research that you're going to be seeing today. So I am a sociologist, which is a little bit different than many of my colleagues in the field of autism. So I've just wanted to take a little bit of time to bring to you guys some really core ideas about sociology that I think can help us to better understand that journey to adulthood for people with disabilities. In sociology, we ask these big questions. One of our big questions is, how does our society shape our everyday lives? And these larger social structures have been identified, for example, values and norms, laws, religion. All of these things can shape how we live our everyday lives. And it's sort of like a top-down kind of perspective on our lives, that there are these big, large social structures that can really shape how everything happens for us. And, for example, values about neurodiversity in the workplace, or norms that support alternative ways of interacting, like a diverse kinds of social interactions, or laws that protect the rights of people with disabilities. These are larger social structures that can create better inclusion and participation for people with disabilities. However, these larger social structures also can create inequality when they exclude people with disabilities, and they can create stigma, and they can create discrimination and bias in our everyday lives for people who have differences. And so these larger structures can be changed and transformed to help us, but they can also, if they're not, create inequality. So we think about this a lot when we consider the medical model of disability. So in the medical model of disability, we're really focusing on changing the person. The person is the problem in this conceptualization, and the focus is on cure or lessening the effect. And that's really kind of that bigger idea that, these larger social structures can't be changed. The thing that we have to change is the person. And that's kind of the core idea of the medical model. Here is another big question in sociology, which is, how do our everyday social interactions shape society? Here, we think it's a bottom-up idea about society and what to change and what to think about. And here we're really thinking about all the many interactions that we have in our everyday lives with our families, with our friends, with our peers, at work, in the community, in all these different settings, which you you can consider as like an ecological network of interactions. We each have our own unique network of people that we interact with every day, whether it's just when we go to the market to buy food and we're interacting with the people there. So it doesn't necessarily have to be people who you're very tightly connected to, but just all of the many ways in which we are connected to others in our society. Those are our ecological networks. And in this view, these interactions, they shape society. They make up society. So social theorists who think about the society in this way, they say that society is really made up of all of these everyday social interactions that we have. And so the focus needs to be on changing the way in which we interact and building different kinds of interactional supports for people. And this is really where most of my work is focused, and the work that I'm going to share with you today. It's really focused on taking a very deep look at the way we interact and how we interact and who we interact with, and how we can maybe alter or change our networks to impact this journey to adulthood that we're thinking about today. And there is, just as there is inequality in these larger social structures, there is also inequality in our social interactions. There are people who have many connections and are very central in their networks and have a lot of access to resources and knowledge. And then there are people who are more peripheral or even isolated or even excluded, who have no access to those resources. And so that is another really important dimension of our social interactions, not just that we're connected to people, but what are the resources that flow through those connections, and who might be, excluded or isolated from the resources that can really make a difference. So here we think about the social model of disability, and this model of disability really thinks about how society is structured in a way that disables people. So the focus really here is on changing society rather than changing the person. And I think that this model is much more focused on interactions and creating that society from the bottom up that has inclusive interactions where it's like the title of this conference, where everyone belongs. And today, well, all these things I've been talking about so far, they're important at all the different stages of our life. Today, I'm going to focus my attention and our attention on that transition to adulthood and the interactional system for those young adults who are moving into, leaving high school and moving into adulthood. So just to revisit what we talked about, there's these social structures, and we think to ourselves, how much do these determine the transition to adulthood? And then these social interactions, how much do they determine the transition to adulthood? And like I said, the focus of this talk is really on this part, the social interactions. And here's just a refresher of the topic. I feel like I wanted to do like a sociology overview first before we dive in. So here we are at the beginning of the talk, which is titled An Ecological Life Course Perspective of the Journey to Adulthood for People with Disabilities. Now, I have spent much of my, the last 10 to 15 years of my research career focusing on autism. And I am going to be sharing with you data about autism, but I think many of these ideas are still relevant and can inform the experiences of people who have other kinds of disabilities. So just a brief overview of the learning objectives of the talk. What does transition success look like from an ecosystem perspective? How might ecosystems help or hinder transition success? How might social networks help with transition success? So first, I'm going to start off with some research from my colleagues here at the A.J. Drexel Autism Institute, who've really been studying, kind of giving us indicators of what life is like for autistic young adults. And they have found in their research that many autistic young adults are disconnected from employment, disconnected from education, and disconnected from services. In fact, they've coined this term. Paul Shattuck and his colleagues here at LCO have coined the term the services cliff, so the transition services cliff, this idea that when autistic youth leave high school, they face a really drastic drop off of services and support and connection. Here's one of their findings from a study they did, that Paul Shattuck and his colleagues did in 2012, which really shows you how dramatic this disconnection is for people on the autism spectrum when compared maybe with intellectual disability or some other learning disability or some other disabilities. The rate is very high 1 year post high school. And that's this part of the graph right here at the top, 60%. So much different and higher rate of disconnection that we see here for autistic young adults. Then they did find also that 1 out of 4 disconnected youth also had no access to services since high school. So they dubbed those, doubly disconnected youth. And finally, here's some data that they published about this services cliff, sort of across different types of service. So the gray bar is the percent of people who were receiving the service in high school, and then this blue colored bar is the number that were receiving it in adulthood. And you can see the drop off for every type of service. So to tackle this problem, the research that I've been doing with my lab and with my many colleagues is to take a much deeper look at the ecosystem around the autistic young adult. So Bronfenbrenner is a psychologist who has a very popular theory about how to think about this ecosystem. So rather than just saying it's one ecosystem, Bronfenbrenner divides it up into different types of ecosystems. And the first and most important ecosystem is the people who are connected to the young adult. So what you see here is the people connected to the young adult, the family members, the people at school, the peers, the people in the neighborhood, all the different people who are immediately connected to the youth, and those are the ones that he calls the microsystem. Then he created another name for the next system out, which is called the mesosystem. And this mesosystem is really, really exciting for me as a social network scientist, because basically Bronfenbrenner says that those people in the microsystem, they all interact with each other. And those interactions really matter for that young adult. So for example, how the family, how parents might coordinate with health services about the youth, or with school about the youth, or with the community about the youth, trying to create and align supports. Those interactions are called the mesosystem. And then finally, there's this exosystem, which is the people who are supporting the supporters. So one way to think about Bronfenbrenner's work is the microsystem in yellow is all the people who are connected to the youth. The mesosystem is the connections of those supporters with each other. And then the exosystem are the connections that those people have with others who are not connected to the youth. So in social network research, we just call these steps, 2 steps out from the person. So you can use social network analysis to create a social network map for one person, for one young adult. You can show the people the young adult is connected to. You can show the connections among the people who are connected to the young adult, and then who do they go to for further support. One way to think about this for transition and how it might be important is to think about something like employment. Oftentimes you learn about jobs and employment opportunities from people, who know your supporters, right? Maybe people who know your parents or your teachers or other people. They know someone out there that knows something about a job, and then somehow it comes back to you through your network. So those resources, they're not always coming to you from the people who are right there with you. They're sometimes coming to you from the connections that the people who you're connected to have. And that's the kind of insight that you get when you think about context as a network. And again, this macro system is more like that first sociological question that I asked, which is, how do our values and our norms shape our everyday lives? And of course, the chronosystem is that life course perspective that these things are going to vary and change depending on where we are in our life course. So what I've been focusing on is this micro, meso, and exosystem, and conceptualizing and measuring and trying to understand how each young adult's network system, what it looks like, and where the gaps and opportunities and strengths might be in that system. This work really lends itself well to this saying that we've said many times in many different ways. I've just added a new word to it, which is it takes a networked village to transition to adulthood. So really trying to focus on that connection piece in the village. So what do networked villages look like? I'm actually going to take a little bit of a deviation and share with you just some work that helps me to understand some of these key concepts that I'm going to share next. And that is Suzanne Simard's work on the social life of forests. And I think about this work, it means a lot to me because it is a concrete example of something that I'm going to share with you that it's kind of invisible. But here, it's actually, she discovered this under the ground. So maybe some of you know this work, but basically she talks about how you have a plant growing in the ground, and we used to just think about the roots of the plant, like, oh, the plant will be strong because it has deep roots. But she discovered that actually the plant itself and its roots were connected to a whole different network under the ground, invisible to our eye, that actually is very important to the well-being of the plant. In fact, this network in red, which is a fungal network underneath the ground, it connects all the plants to each other. In actually, resources flow through those fungal networks. And I created a little picture here to show you that through the red lines, there's all sorts of resources flowing from one plant to another plant. And basically, it's like this underground entanglement, and she's actually measuring it all, and it's actually a physical, concrete thing that you can measure here that she discovered that we didn't even know existed. And in sociology, there is a similar concept. It's called social capital. So when we're connected to each other, the connections, it's not just the connections that are important, but it is the resources that flow through those connections, the opportunities, the learning, the coordination, the support, the things that help us focus, that motivate us. Those are things that can flow through our networks. So when we're thinking about this transition to adulthood, this journey to adulthood, we can ask ourselves, what kind of social capital might a young adult with disabilities need for transition? So you might want to carefully look at a young adult's ecosystem network and ask yourself, is there navigational support here? Are there diverse types of resources? Because one thing that can hamper, constrain a network is if there's only one kind of resource. The idea is we want to have a diversity of resources to get to where we need to go. And does the network allow for learning and the ability to gain knowledge about new things, so that, especially for this transition to adulthood, we learn our whole lives, but when we're transitioning to adulthood, there are many new things that we have to learn about the world. and many things to transition, not just our education or our way of working, but also our healthcare. Young people are learning all new systems, and so their networks really need to support that learning, that knowledge gain that they're seeking to have during that time in their lives. And one really robust finding about networks, and in that's been proven again and again in sociology, is that they influence us. Who we're connected to, it influences not just our behaviors, like maybe if we have a positive way of thinking about focusing on our studies, or maybe we have people around us who are not as into that, and they might change how we're thinking about our focuses, and we can be influenced by the peers around us and the people around us. And so it's important to think about how much support is there in that network to influence the youth to get to where they want to go and to achieve their goals. I am going to be showing you some network maps, so I just want to do a very basic tutorial about what you're going to be seeing. So in some of these pictures, you're going to see a bunch of circles, and the circles are all people, and then you're going to see lines, and the lines represent a connection between different people. And basically the way I collect this data is we ask people to fill out a survey, a social network survey, where they identify who the people are in their network and the connections among them. So you'll see some of that data soon. We color the circles sometimes by role. So sometimes when you see the circles, there'll be different colors. And the colors usually represent, maybe they're from school, maybe they're from home, maybe they're from the community. So there'll be different colors in the map. So again, just to say, what we're thinking about here is how to use network science to build networked ecosystems that can create transition success. And I think, there are these three important steps. And the first one is really important. Me as a researcher, and my colleagues, we've been seeking to understand what these networks look like. So we investigate them sort of as a researcher, but any person can investigate their own network. They can focus their attention to understand who they're connected to, and how are those people connected, and how are the people connected to them connected to others. And those insights can help people to figure out how to navigate their networks and access some resources. And they can help the people who are connected to these young adults during their transition to figure out what they can do. So it's not just about the youth doing something new or different with their network, but it's about everyone in the network understanding their contributions and how they can build their own network for support for the youth. So in the microsystem, you can ask yourself, like, who is connected to me if you're a young person? You can also ask, if you're part of the network, you can say, who's connected to my young person? And there are possible strategic actions to take. In a network, you can add new people, you can add new connections, you can strengthen existing connections, and you can increase access to that social capital that I talked about. And so, really trying to decide during transition, all of these questions are going to be very different for each person, very individual, because everyone's network is different. So it's really important that investigate and diagnose and build considerations are all very much about each person's own ecosystem. Now, there are different important gaps that we might want to address if they're not there. So like if a youth is only connected to family, then you start to think about what other kinds of groups of people could we build to create a more diverse network. The new connections, those new connections, they can create new opportunities for the youth. Strengthening the existing connections is a really important strategy that a lot of people aren't necessarily thinking about. But when young people transition to adulthood, they often also experience some disconnections from their major supports, their family and maybe their peers and friends. But as they're transitioning, it is an opportunity to remember how to stay connected to people who are important and how to focus and build those connections as well. And when you're thinking about increasing access to social capital, you're really thinking about not just individual people's resources, but organizational resources, community resources, employment support resources, educational support resources and services. So all of those organizational infrastructure, having people that are part of those systems as part of your network actually opens up the opportunity for you to be able to access the social capital that's there. And here's our first map. So we have our autistic youth. This is just for illustration, so you can see kind of what these maps look like. Here's our autistic young adult here. You can see the people from school who are connected to this young adult. So these are the green circles. And you can see there's 3 up here that are not connected immediately to the autistic young adult. Then the people in blue, these 3 here, are the service providers. Here's the family connections, the community connections, and the workplace connections. So you can begin to see who is part of this autistic young adult's microsystem. Now we get to think systematically, not just about the microsystem, but also about the mesosystem. How are the people around the young adult, connected to the young adult, connected to each other? And you can ask the same set of questions, really. Are there new connections that need to be forged to create alignment and coordination and collaboration that could really make changes for that young adult? So are there new connections that are needed? And how could we strengthen existing connections? Because transition is a time where a lot of ties experience a lot of stress, and the idea of strengthening ties is also really important insight during times of really high change. That's when our ties are at most risk. And again, here, the strategic discussion to have if you're a supporter of a young person with a disability who's experiencing transition is to ask yourself, what kind of organizational resources can I locate for this person? What kind of community resources or employment supports? How do I bring those in? How do I figure out who to connect to, who has these resources? How do I be strategic about building the social capital that this young adult is going to need? And finally, this is just that exosystem. So supporters have these other ties to people out there in the world, and that those ties can bring resources to the youth. Here's a network map of the mesosystem and the exosystem. So the young adult is no longer in this map because the map is all the people who are connected to the youth. How are they connected to each other? So here, it's that same set of circles that we looked at before, but the lines here are related to how they're connected to each other. And here's where we start to understand like who's most central in these networks. And we have found through much of our research that there usually is a parent who's right there in the middle of this network, connected to all of these other different parts of the ecosystem, and they're right there in the middle. These circles are sized by who has the most connections and who has less connections. So you can kind of see in size how there's a really big pink circle, which is the family connector, who's really connected to all these other different people. And then you have a bigger green circle indicating that there is someone on the education side who's more connected to others. And what you really see in this network is you have some key leaders and you have some people who are more peripheral. And that is what this ecosystem looks like for this particular example for the youth. But like I said before, everyone's network village is different. And when you're looking at, here's 2 different ones, one that's very sparse, that's more reflective of that data that I showed you earlier about some of the really big challenges that some autistic youth are facing post-transition. They're disconnected from service, they're disconnected from education, disconnected from workplace. You know, they're really missing, you can really see that this, that network, that underground network that I showed you before, but this is not underground, this is just that invisible network that's around this autistic young adult here. So the whole idea of using network analysis is to make visible these disparities and to start to help build strategically each of the different networks around young people who are transitioning. So here's some network maps from some of the studies I've done, and this is very preliminary. So, I'm at the beginning stages of asking young adults to tell me what their network looks like. And in this case, these are autistic young adults. And then visualizing it and characterizing it using social network analysis. And this is a very, very small sample, so it's not representative, but it's the very beginning stages of understanding what might be important in these networks for young autistic adults. And one of the preliminary findings that we had was that for example, the males who took the network survey, their networks were primarily family and very dense and connected, whereas females had more moderate density, but they were more diverse. So you had different kinds of people, and the pink is community and the green is family. Yeah. And then we did have just a few gender nonconforming participants in our very small study, and we saw that those networks were a little bit different too. So we're getting to the beginning stages of really being able to look at these networks and see how they vary and what might matter. We collected a lot of data during COVID, and we did find that autistic young adult networks were adversely impacted by COVID. You can see in red 43% less interaction during COVID, but they did have 38% no change and 15% more interaction. So you can kind of see the distribution of those among the different roles of people, types of people in their network. In the way that we're measuring networks, we're also really interested in looking at the network from the perspective of the autistic youth, the network from the parent's perspective, and then the network from a transition supporter. So we have these cases where we asked all three people to give us their network, and then we combined them all together to form what we call a multicentric network. And in this way, we're able to capture some of that ecosystem, that micro, that meso, and that exosystem that I was talking about earlier. We're able to capture that. Here it's colored for COVID. So everything that's red is less frequent contact. The gray is same contact. The green is more contact, and the yellow is mixed contact, meaning some people reported more contact, other people reported less contact, so it was mixed. But really, you can really start to see the impact of COVID on these networks right away. Just this, the transition supporters and the parent, you can really see that whole network just dropped out. And the impact of COVID on the ecosystem of the youth is pretty significant. We've also done some data collection before transition and after transition. And we've looked at how the size of the network, in the pre-transition period, how was it predictive of these outcomes post-transition? So we have a little bit of analysis from the young adults perspective, and then that ecosystem network that I showed you earlier. And you can see that for transition success, the size of the network is negatively correlated with transition success, both in the youth network and when you combine all the networks together. There is some interesting kind of mixed findings for employment and quality of life, which we're hoping to do further research on. Also, too, we've developed an app. We want to begin to build these networks, and we're asking the question here, can a network support app improve transition by helping the youth to build their own networks and connections? And so we call the app Trestle after these trestle bridges that were built across our country when railroads were going across, and they were particularly for areas that were almost impossible to traverse. So they would build these incredibly intricate trestle bridges. So we call our network app Trestle. And in the app, we have the youth on board their team. So basically you have the youth, you have their home team, their school team, their community team, and even their work team if they have people at work that they want to onboard onto the app. And the app provides a location for the network to support the youth. We've had some initial positive feedback for the app, but we really need to do much more research. It's not publicly available because we want to test it out. There are many apps in the world that don't work. So we're hoping we're at the testing stage of the app to see, can an app help autistic youth to build their transition networks and to connect together their transition supporters. In our preliminary finding, we did get again, we have to have the full sample before we know for sure, but we did see a difference between the goals completed and by those youth who were using the app. Now, there's other ways to think about improving the transition pathways for autistic youth, and my colleagues here at the Autism Institute have been working really hard on two different really important initiatives. The first one is really working on employment training. So they've been creating these different programs that give autistic youth work experience in the community with job coaches and supporters. And they create these. I actually have several of these youth working in my own lab, and they learn skills, and they work with my colleagues and my staff to contribute to the lab. So they become embedded in these work situations. It's called one of the programs is called Project Search, and it gives them multiple internship opportunities. That idea that having those work experiences and learning how to connect and to work in the workplace, in the community, is more predictive of employment later. So another thing that my colleagues here at LCO are doing is they are training businesses to change what they do. So they're really trying to change the way businesses include neurodiverse people in their workplaces. So a lot of this work, when I have my Project Search interns in my lab, we all have to learn how to have neurodiverse colleagues. So there's learning on our part. And it's this same thing that they're doing with businesses in their inclusion center, is going out and helping to change workplaces. So these are very important ways that people that work with me here at the A.J. Drexel Autism Institute are changing society. Finally, all of the work that we're doing is in partnership. In my lab, we have different kinds of partnership with autistic people, their families, and community supporters. We have what we call a cycle of inclusion in our lab. So we're maximizing inclusion in the way that we develop our tools and how we do our research. We do a lot of focus groups or interviews with people, or pilot testing or cognitive interviews, so that we get feedback about our instruments. Then we do, in our screening for inclusion into our studies, we've developed accommodation strategies to make sure that everyone who is part of our inclusion category can participate in our research. And then we also have community advisory boards, and currently we have an autistic community advisory board who's informing our research for the AIRB4 research project that's HRSA funded, and they're also developing their own ideas about how they want to help change society to support autistic adults. So there are many different ways a lab can maximize inclusion. Finally, our community partnership work is done using the community partnered participatory research model that was developed by Dr. Loretta Jones, and I was very lucky to be trained by Dr. Jones in how to do this work. And the really important focus of the CPPR model is on transparency, accountability, and equal power sharing between academics and communities.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was so great. I've always understand social networks better after I listen to you. We do have a fair amount of questions, so I'm trying to kind of group them and organize them a little bit for us. But one of the things that was really striking was how much parents, family members were really the center of those networks. And so there were a couple different ways people were asking questions. One was sort of like, how do I help my young adult build their social capital, right? If they might not want to. And I know we are both parents of young adults who may or may not wish to listen to their family member, right, as their network leader, and other families saying, how do I get myself out of that case manager role and put someone else in the center of that network? So I wonder if you have thoughts about how to do that.
Yes, I deeply, deeply appreciate those questions from personal and professional perspective. I would say part of this work is meant to make obvious how much these caregivers are doing, right? Because part of what you want to do when you're trying to make a strong network is to figure out if the network is only reliant on one person. Because once that person is gone, then the whole network falls apart. So it's really important to think about this at a life course perspective, right? And a lot of parents have talked to me about how they, they really are thinking about the idea of trying to generate connections and diversify connections, so that as the young person grows into adulthood, they have their community. Now, one way that I have found that this can happen is through, like I said before, organizations. So community organizations, we have a partnership with the Jewish Community Center in New York City, and they have all of this different kinds of programming for autistic young adults. It's a and they as a community center are creating an alternative home for that person. So really, social capital, it's not just the most important, I think, impactful way to think about social capital. It's not just an individual having a lot of resources. Our society resources are they collect around organizations. And so if you can access organizations, that's where you can find connections to other options. And I think that first question about how to do it when your youth isn't necessarily interested in doing network building, that is a challenging problem. I think one thing I noticed was that this is a personal anecdote. When I put my daughter on the app, she all of a sudden could say to me, like, you can't talk to me about these issues. You have to put them on the app, and then I can control them now. So that, like, it put some distance between me and her, and it was very helpful. Like, so I do think these networks, even though they feel onerous to build, they can create the structures that are more sustainable for the parent, but still very challenging.
Yeah, we have so many questions I'm trying to go through. So one of the questions, and I know this is of interest to you, is thinking about equity and networks in underserved or historically marginalized communities, and that the resources may be different types of capital, and also perhaps the kind of organizational resources or structural resources may not be as rich as they are in affluent networks. Have you thought about how we can leverage networks to access more resources?
Yes.
From those communities?
I mean, I actually came to this work through working in urban schools as a teacher. And it was very clear to me the disparities between my experiences teaching in urban public schools with fewer resources than maybe some of my stints in a private school settings, where I could see all different kinds of ways in which resources were flowing through the school and through the different institutions. So I have put a lot of thought into how do we build better infrastructures, and that's one of the things that the research tells us is that there are opportunities in people's communities that are overlooked by people outside. So, it's that barbershop, it's that, that church, that different kind of affiliation. And also there's some really good work about how Black social capital looks different and has different strengths and important components that we really need to understand better. I know, Aubin, I'm thinking of Elizabeth Morgan's work on Black families and advocacy and how important their family, the mothers of mothers, are. That was just one of her findings. But I do
Yeah.
think that this is an area that needs much more attention. And I think one way that I'm trying to tackle it now is to try and build tools for districts. Instead of trying to build tools for teachers, you build a tool that the district will then distribute through all of the schools, right? Not just the schools in wealthier neighborhoods.
So a lot of people are asking about the app. I know you said it is not yet available because you're still researching it. Are there thoughts about when it might be available, or are there research studies people could get involved in? I just have to ask.
Yes, there are. We definitely are recruiting now. For the trial. We're just having people trial the app to see if it's useful to them. I think app development, I've learned, is a growth learning. Like, it just feels like you're always learning something new that you could do better on the app. But I do think we currently have a study where we're recruiting people to trial the app for us between the ages of 13 and 29. Um, and I do know that there are other kinds of app solutions out there too. So it's always worth exploring. Like, here's an app that I find very useful, that in a weird way, for networks. It's called the Ink app, which is basically just a way to send thank you notes to your family. And that whole idea about strengthening ties. Um, I find that there are some apps out there that help us to do things and pay attention to things that are harder for us to do with the noise of everyday life, and all the chaos. So I think there's some interesting options now for digital apps.
So I'm going to ask you one more really direct question. You can tell me no, but is there like a link or somewhere people could sign up for that study?
Yes, I could definitely provide that.
Okay, great. We can add that to the Padlet for folks because they're very interested. I know we're doing a study here around social networking and preschoolers, right? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So we're really, we've done some research for young adults, and then we built the app based on the research. But now we're at the beginning stages of looking at preschoolers who are minimally verbal. That's a really important time for language development, and we were really interested in looking at the devices that people use to support language development. How are they coordinating in the ecosystem? Like, how is the device being coordinated across home and school and community? And does that coordination actually help with language development? So we're studying that right now. I think it's an open question. That's why we get to do research. We have hypotheses about that, but it's important across the life course that coordination, collaboration, alignment, those things matter in different ways at different times in the life course, especially during these big times of transition, like going from, preschool to kindergarten, or going from high school to post high school.
Yeah, great. So I'll add that info about that study for preschoolers to our Padlet as well. So similarly, you're talking about people who are minimally verbal. How does that look in these networks? Are people who are minimally verbal have been included in your research, or how's that look for employment and things?
I really appreciate that question. The way that we're doing studies in our lab is by focusing on particular different groups, making sure we're doing studies across the spectrum for autism, but also making sure each study is really about what's important to that group. So, for example, that EPIC study, that preschool study, we're really looking at that communication device and how it's being coordinated. That's really important for a preschooler who's not speaking yet. But then for adults, we have a study that we conducted on minimally verbal young adults, and that study was focused on the transition from pediatric to adult care. So really trying to understand that medical transition, and we were looking at their networks there, and how their healthcare networks were impacted by that transition, and what they looked like. And we're at the very beginning stages of that study as well. We've analyzed the data, and we're just getting actually ready to publish that. But I do think that um, what we found to be important for our minimally verbal young adults was that their family was such an important part of their lives, and not just their immediate family, but also their extended family, and also their connections to organizations. So when they were connected to a hospital that had a lot of connections to other resources, like that were not hospital specific, so like resources in the community that were connected to the hospital, those youth, their families were able to connect the youth to those resources through the hospital. So this is another example of how organizations can really broker resources for different populations.
Thank you. So lots of people asking kind of the best way to apply this in our disability systems or in their work as a provider, how they can use either kind of social network measures or information to help build these networks for young adults. Do you have, I know these are really hard questions you're getting.
No, I like this question. I like this question a lot. I would think I can share this with the Padlet too, but I actually shared it when I spoke at the Mind a few years back. Actually it's called it's like a ecosystem mapping tool that you can use that practitioners can use with their families or with their youth to help them kind of map out their networks. You don't have to use fancy network software tools, but you can actually do that pen and paper drawing out of the network, and it has some categories and questions you can ask and ways of thinking about social capital and connections, and just bringing people's attention to their networks is a huge deal. I think it's surprising when you pay attention to something, how it can help you to just think about what to do next.
I feel like that's a tool we learn to use an early start, right? When we're thinking about the child's ecosystem, and then somehow, as soon as kids turn 3, we forget that we all have ecosystems that we continue to need to think about. Okay, let me see. We have a couple more minutes. Do you mind if I keep going with a few more questions?
Absolutely. I'm just so glad I didn't overtalk so that I
Oh
had
no, you're
time to ask
great.
questions.
So are there ways that we can use social networks, do you think, to help prepare people transition age, or actually someone wanted to know, when do we start this preparation for more diverse career paths and those that give you a living wage salary? Is there a way that networks can have a role in that?
Absolutely. I think one thing networks can do is it give that knowledge, that learning. If you're thinking about the network with a learning lens, you can ask yourself, like, oh, my youth is interested in web design or in digital media, and what are some of the ways in which I can get them connected to people who are doing this kind of thing. Like, one exposure to people who are already where you're going or where you want to go is a really powerful way to begin to get to that next place. Like, I think trying to infuse it's that influence mechanism that I spoke about. You can really influence people through their networks, but you have to bring in these different kinds of connections. And that too, like, I feel like all the time when I'm giving these suggestions, I'm just giving more work to the parent or the person in the network. But what I would say is to really look for other organizations or other through the internet or other ways to connect to these resources, but just trying to figure out, we are now far more networked than we ever. I mean, it's not true that networks weren't robust before we had the internet. We had very tight networks then. It's just now there's access to so many diverse kinds of things.
Yeah.
It's really important.
So we have some people who work with older adults or adults listening who maybe didn't have access to early intervention or were diagnosed later. Is it ever too late to form networks?
No, 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 and no. We have, I was just in a whole study session for NIH where we were brainstorming how to build networks for older adults who've entered into care systems.
Mhm.
So, there's these connections, they matter at every single stage of our lives, and it's never too late to figure out how to do them and to act like to figure out ways to broker these connections and build them. You can think about things like, well, if you think about things like LinkedIn, but I feel like I'm LinkedIn and Facebook are more my era, but when I look at my daughter, she's on like these servers that, that they have where they're all on there together and making networks through Instagram or other ways of playing games together on Minecraft. There's all these different ways to connect.
Yeah. We probably have time for one more question. There are a couple people who are asking about whether you thought about the connection between these social networks or thinking about them and how they fit with person-centered planning. I don't know if that's something you really thought about.
Yeah, more so with that minimally verbal young adult transition to adult care project. We did some really interesting thinking about that planning. I think that planning component. I do think that using network visualizations or network thinking to begin to understand where the gaps and opportunities and strengths are could really assist in a planning process. And the whole goal is that each person has their own robust network as they move, and diverse, multi-pronged network as they grow through their lives. And that's really the vulnerability, is when you have everything, it's like a one-legged stool. It just isn't sturdy. So, you have to build those networks that have connections in different areas and different kinds of connections so that you have that three-legged stool and stable.
Yeah, yeah.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was founded in 1998 with the promise to reduce and prevent the disabilities that can be associated with autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. Every day, our clinicians and researchers make progress on that promise. Our groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other conditions associated with disability are helping affected individuals achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website or our social media platforms to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.